There are more than 800 officially documented ghost towns in the American West, and those are only the ones that have been surveyed, cataloged, and assigned a name in some state or federal registry. The unofficial number, the number that includes the mining camps that grew for 3 seasons and collapsed in the 4th, the rail depots that got bypassed when the line rerouted, the agricultural settlements that dried up when the aquifer did, the small communities that simply ceased to provide enough reason for anyone to stay. That number is in the thousands, and it describes a landscape of abandonment, so distributed and so thorough that the West, if you know where to look, is as much a record of departed intention as it is a record of present habitation. These are not dramatic ruins, most of them. They are not Pompeii. They are wood and corrugated tin and concrete block, weathered to a color somewhere between gray and the specific shade of brown that the desert assigns to everything it takes back. And they stand in varying states of structural integrity in valleys and on hillsides and at the ends of tracks that lead off paved roads into territories that most people never turn onto. Norman Pryce turned onto one of those tracks in the fall of 2007. He was 48 years old. He had a rusted 1989 Ford pickup with a camper shell on the bed that served as his living space, and he had a reason, which was also a lack of reason, to be wherever he decided to be. The mining district he drove into was on the Nevada side of the border with California, in a high basin where the elevation kept the summer heat at bay and brought the winter down hard and early, and where the remnants of a silver operation from the 1920s sat in the alkali flat at the foot of a dark range, a cluster of structures that included 2 intact stone buildings, a partially collapsed timber frame mill building, and a scattering of smaller structures in various states of persistence. The nearest paved road was 11 miles away. The nearest town with a gas station was 23 miles. Norman was not the first person to find the place. He found out over the first few days that 3 other people had already established themselves there. 2 of them were a man and a woman, Roy and Deb, who had arrived in a converted cargo trailer about 2 months before and had set up on the south side of the stone buildings where the afternoon sun warmed the walls enough to compensate partially for the cold that came off the mountains after dark. The third was a man named Pinto, which was either his name or his nickname, and who didn't elaborate, who lived in the back of a disassembled Winnebago chassis that someone had cut down years earlier and that he'd been moving incrementally through the desert southwest for a period of time he described as a while. Pinto was the one who knew the most about the place, having arrived first, and he shared what he knew with the economy of someone who considered information a material thing. You gave it when it was needed and in the quantity that was needed and not in excess. What was needed, in October of 2007 at that elevation in that high basin, was a plan for winter. And winter at that elevation was not a theoretical challenge. It was a specific set of conditions that would arrive with the first snow and would then remain in some form through March or later, and that included overnight temperatures that dropped to 20 below zero in the worst stretches, and that would kill a person sleeping without adequate insulation and heat in the way that cold kills, which is quietly and without drama, and often without the person being fully aware of what is happening until the awareness itself becomes unreliable. Norman had the camper shell and a sleeping bag rated to 10 degrees, which covered most normal winter nights but not the worst ones, and which covered nothing about the practical problems of life at those temperatures: the water freezing in the containers, the diesel gelling in the truck, the cold that made any task performed with bare hands briefly agonizing, and anything requiring fine motor control nearly impossible. He had, however, something that the other 3 residents of the ghost town did not have in equal measure, which was a background in practical mechanics and systems work, specifically in the heating systems of commercial buildings, which he had maintained for a facilities management company in Reno for 14 years before the position was eliminated as part of a restructuring, that the company described as operational efficiency, and that Norman described in the privacy of his thoughts in other terms. He understood heat transfer. He understood the physics of insulation and the principles of combustion and the behavior of fluid systems in cold weather, and he understood them not abstractly but in the specific practical way that comes from having to keep systems running in real buildings, through real winters when the alternative was a building full of people who were cold and a supervisor who would hear about it. He walked through the 2 intact stone buildings on his second day and assessed them the way he assessed buildings in his former work, looking at the structure, the penetrations, the exposure, the thermal mass of the walls, and whether it was working for the occupants or against them. The stone was good. 2-foot-thick rubble masonry had a thermal mass that a wood frame structure could not approach, which meant it was slow to heat and slow to cool, which was exactly what you wanted in a structure you were trying to keep warm. The heat you put in during the day, the walls stored, and they gave it back at night when the exterior temperature dropped and the temperature differential between inside and outside was largest. The problem was the openings, the doors and windows, which had been replaced over the years with lumber-framed openings that fit imprecisely and leaked air in volumes that the thermal mass could not compensate for. He told Roy and Deb what he'd found, in the direct way of someone conveying technical information, and they listened. Pinto listened from a distance, not joining the conversation but not leaving either, which Norman had come to understand was his way of absorbing information without committing to the social interaction that asking questions would have required. The fix for the windows was straightforward in concept and required materials, which was where the constraint was. Norman had brought a supply of 6mm polyethylene sheeting, which was useful for a number of things and which he could use to create interior window insulation by cutting panels slightly larger than the opening and stapling them to the interior frame with an overlap that compressed against the wall to form a seal. He had enough for his camper shell and a little over. He did not have enough for both stone buildings. What he had was the knowledge of how to do it, and what the four of them had collectively was a set of tools and materials and skills that, when laid out and assessed together, was more useful than any of them had realized working separately. This is the kind of calculus that always surprises people until they've done it once and then seems obvious forever after. The inventory you hold when you think of yourself as one person with what you have is smaller than the inventory you hold when you think of the group as a unit with what it has collectively, and the practical capability of the second kind of thinking over the first is not proportional to the numbers but multiplicative in a way that takes people by surprise every time. The Crisiscraft Field Manual covers this specifically, the approach to collective resource assessment, and the frameworks for thinking about shared infrastructure in situations exactly like this one, where the materials are scarce and the margin is thin, and the difference between a solution and no solution is often the question of whether you can see the resources you actually have. It's in the bio link, and if you're in a situation that requires this kind of thinking, or might be, it is worth having before you need it. Roy had a wood stove, a small cast iron unit he'd been using in the cargo trailer, which was adequate for the trailer, but which was also portable, and which, when assessed as a group resource rather than a personal one, was most useful not in the trailer but in the better insulated of the two stone buildings, where it could heat a significantly larger and more thermally stable space that multiple people could occupy during the coldest parts of the day, night. Moving the stove required Roy to accept that his personal accommodation was becoming a shared resource, which was a decision that Roy made without particular ceremony, after Norman explained the thermal math to him. Because Roy was a practical man and the math was clear, Deb had tarps, an unusually large supply of them, 6mm heavy-duty in a range of sizes, acquired over years of outdoor living in the way that certain materials accumulate in the possession of people who have learned through experience that they are always useful. She had not specifically planned to insulate a ghost town with them, but the tarps became, in Norman's assessment of the collective inventory, the most critical single material resource the group possessed, because the thermal performance of the stone buildings was limited above all else by the air penetration through the window and door openings, and tarps, properly installed, were an effective and durable solution to that problem. The installation took a day and a half. Norman cut and hung the tarps as interior window covers across all the openings in the primary building, lapping them around the frames and weighting their bases with rocks to press them against the sills. He caulked the gaps around the interior frames with a silicone compound he found in Roy's toolbox, which Roy had brought for reasons that were originally unrelated to this project, but that turned out to be exactly what the job needed. He fitted the doorway with a double-layer baffle, 2 overlapping panels of tarp material hung from a rod at the top that could be pushed through, without requiring the opening to be fully breached, reducing the cold air exchange each time someone entered or exited from a flood to a draft. Pinto, who had watched the entire process from varying distances without being asked to participate, appeared on the second afternoon with a length of foam pipe insulation that he applied, without explanation, to the gap at the base of the main door, fitting it with the competence of someone who had done similar work before, and who had decided, on criteria of his own, that this was a moment to contribute. By the time the first serious cold arrived in early November, the primary building was holding heat from the wood stove well enough that the interior temperature, an hour after the stove was banked for the night, was 30 degrees warmer than the exterior, which at that elevation in November was the difference between cold and dangerous. Norman had wired a single bulb LED fixture to a small battery and a solar panel he mounted on the south-facing wall, giving the interior a dim but genuine light source that ran without fuel and without generator noise, and that made the building feel inhabited in a way that changed how it felt to be inside it, a change in psychological register that was more significant than its practical utility, though the practical utility was also real. The water problem was harder, and was the one that Norman thought about most in the weeks before the serious winter arrived. Water froze. That was the fact that organized everything else. At the temperatures this basin produced, any water stored in a vehicle or a container that was not actively heated would freeze solid within hours after nightfall. And frozen water in a container was water you couldn't use, and if the container wasn't designed to accommodate expansion, water that had destroyed its container in the process of freezing. Norman had seen this in commercial buildings, the cracked pipes and the burst fittings and the water damage that resulted from a heating failure on a cold night, and he understood the mechanics of it clearly. The solution he arrived at was a thermal mass system. The stone building had a floor of packed earth overlain with flat stones in the area near the wood stove, and that floor, once the stove had been running for several hours, accumulated heat at a depth that the ambient temperature could not quickly penetrate. He buried 3 5-gallon jugs in a shallow pit immediately adjacent to the stove's base, insulated the top of the pit with layered cardboard and a folded sleeping bag, and found that water stored this way held above freezing through nights that dropped to single digits outside. It was not a perfect system. He was clear about this with the others. It required the stove to run enough each evening to adequately charge the thermal mass, and it required someone to monitor the system and know when the conditions were outside its operating range. But it was reliable within its limitations, and its limitations were known, which was the most important property a system could have. What would you do in that situation? Trying to build a community in a place that had been abandoned, with people you'd met a month earlier and a winter coming that intended to test everything? There's a particular challenge in building trust with strangers under conditions of genuine hardship, where the trust is not optional or decorative but functional, where how much you can rely on the people around you directly determines how well you survive the winter. Do you hold back until you're sure? Do you give what you have before you've established the reciprocity that would make that rational? Leave your thoughts in the comments. There are no wrong answers, only different bets. The winter came in fully by December, and the community that had formed around the 2 stone buildings found its rhythm the way communities form their rhythms, not through discussion or agreement, but through the accumulation of small decisions made in sequence over days and weeks until the pattern that resulted was stable enough to be treated as established. Someone maintained the wood stove, which meant keeping the firebox charged through the night and ash cleared every morning, and the chimney periodically inspected for creosote. Accumulation which at their burn rate was a real hazard, and which Norman addressed by running a section of chain down the flue on a line and pulling it up and down several times every 2 weeks. Someone managed the water storage, which meant checking the buried jugs every morning and reporting on their state, a task that rotated between Roy and Norman on an informal schedule. Pinto managed what might be described as the perimeter, not in any formal security sense, but in the way of someone who moved through a space with constant low-level attention, noticing things, knowing when the patterns changed, returning with information that was useful even when it had not been specifically requested. Deb had skills that none of the others had anticipated, and that became, as the winter deepened, among the most practically important things the group possessed. She was an experienced forager in the specific desert Southwest sense, and she knew what grew in the high basin at what time of year, and what was edible and in what form, and what would make you sick if you prepared it. Wrong. She had a drying system she'd built into the cargo trailer that allowed her to process plant materials she gathered on her daily walks into preserved food that added genuine nutritional diversity to a diet that would otherwise have been almost entirely from cans. She also knew medicinal plants, not in the mystical sense, but in the specific empirical sense of someone who had been using plants to address the minor health problems of outdoor life for long enough to have developed a working knowledge of what addressed what and what was contraindicated for, what and where the lines were between self-management and the kind of problem that needed a clinic. When Roy developed a respiratory infection in January that he was initially inclined to manage stoically, it was Deb who told him what the signs were that would mean he needed to get into town to see a doctor, and it was Norman who drove him when those signs appeared, and Roy who recovered fully in 12 days rather than progressing to the kind of complication that happens when respiratory infections in cold conditions are undertreated. Pinto left in late January as quietly as he'd arrived, his cut-down Winnebago chassis disappearing down the dirt track one morning when the others were occupied. He left behind, at the base of the main door, a canvas bag containing 12 candles, a small hand-operated tire pump, and a folded piece of paper on which was written, in a careful hand, an address in Albuquerque and the name of a woman who would provide a meal and a place to sleep for one night to anyone who showed up and mentioned Pinto's name. The gesture had the quality of things left by people who have decided what they owe to the places and people they pass through, and who fulfill that obligation precisely and without excess. Roy and Deb and Norman stayed through the winter and into the spring. The stone building by March had accumulated small improvements that had accumulated from small problems addressed over months. A shelf built from salvaged timber above the stove for drying things, a second battery and panel added to Norman's electrical system, a gravity-fed water line from a tank he'd installed on the roof of the lower stone structure that ran into the interior when the temperature was above freezing and that could be isolated when it wasn't. The improvements were not grand. They were the kind of thing that any person with skills and time and a specific problem to solve will produce, invisible to anyone who didn't know the problems they had solved, completely legible to anyone who had. When April came and the snow was off the ground and the days were long enough and warm enough to make the travel roads passable, Roy and Deb moved on, their cargo trailer behind their truck, heading toward a situation in the southern part of the state that Roy's brother had described in a letter as a maybe but possibly a real maybe. They left Norman the wood stub, which he accepted without insisting he didn't need it, because they were correct about what the winter would have been without it, and he was not going to dishonor their generosity by pretending otherwise. Norman stayed in the high basin for another season. He wintered there again in 2008. People passed through. A man with a family who stayed 6 weeks and learned the water system and the fire management, and who left better equipped for what came next than when they had arrived. A young woman alone who stayed 3 weeks and left without explanation one morning, but who spent those 3 weeks watching and listening with the attention of someone preparing for something, and who Norman hoped, when he thought about it, had gotten from the place what she'd come for. He became, for those who knew about it through the informal networks of people in similar circumstances, the kind of resource that doesn't advertise itself, a place you could come to in the high basin where you would not be turned away and where you would be told honestly what the situation was and what it required and what it could offer, and then given the choice. To everyone who made it to the end of this one, the communities that form in places like that high basin exist outside every official account of how people survive hard circumstances. They leave no paperwork and no addresses, and they end when they end without announcement. What they leave behind is what they were, the specific product of people choosing, in a situation that did not require it, to build something together rather than manage separately. Another story from another place and another person who made that same choice is on the channel, and it is waiting for you now.